The Haunted House in the Woods. They had meant it to be an adventure and nothing more. Tim said so aloud as they locked the car and shouldered their packs, grinning in a way that suggested the word adventure still meant something simple. Walking farther than they had before, sleeping rough, returning with a story exaggerated only enough to be believed. Josh laughed and agreed, though he had already folded the map twice the wrong way and was pretending not to notice. The woods received them without comment. At first there was a path, narrow, uneven, but clearly worn by others who had passed through before them. Sunlight reached the forest floor in pale fragments. Somewhere above, birds moved, unseen but audible. Everything suggested that they were still within reach of the world they had left behind. It was only later, after the path thinned, then vanished entirely, that Tim began to feel the first quiet unease. They stopped more often. Josh turned the map one way, then another, his finger tracing lines that no longer corresponded to anything around them. "This can't be right, man," he said. "It was back there," Tim replied, gesturing vaguely behind them. "We just missed the turn." They walked on, confident at first, then less so. The trees grew closer together. The light changed, not dimming exactly, but losing its warmth as though the sun were already retreating. By the time they both realized they were lost, neither wanted to say it aloud. The torch came out too late. Josh shook it once, then harder, as though irritation alone might restore it to usefulness. The beam flickered weakly, illuminating the trunk of a nearby tree, then died. They stood in silence. "I thought you bought new batteries, man," Tim said. "I thought I did, okay?" Josh replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew it would not matter. They tried to make a fire. The ground was damp, the wood reluctant. Smoke rose without flame, stinging their eyes and clinging to their clothes. Around them, the forest changed. They heard something then, too irregular to be wind, too distant to identify. A shift, a pause, then again. Josh turned slowly. "Did you hear that?" Tim nodded, though he could not have said what he had heard. They did not like standing still after that. Stillness felt like permission. So they walked without direction, without agreement, hoping only to stumble into something familiar. They found light instead. It was faint, no more than a suggestion caught between the trunks of trees where no light should be. They stopped at once, afraid to acknowledge it too fully. "A house?" Josh said finally. They stood there for a long moment, neither moving toward it nor away. The house did not belong there. It arose from the woods at an angle that felt wrong. Its roof lines sharp against the darkening sky, its windows glowing dimly, unevenly, as though lit by hand rather than electricity. The trees pressed close around it, branches leaning inward as if listening. "This isn't right," Tim said. "No," Josh agreed, "but neither is freezing out here." They approached slowly. The closer they came, the more the house revealed its age. The wood was dark, the paint long gone. The windows were narrow and tall, their glass uneven. The door stood open. They stopped again at the threshold. You ever notice, Josh said quietly, how in every story like this the door's already open? Tim forced a laugh. That's because if it was locked, there wouldn't be a story. They waited. Nothing moved. Inside, candles burned. Not many, just enough to suggest someone had placed them deliberately. The air smelled of old wood and cold stone, but not rot. Dust lay thick on most surfaces, untouched except near the hearth, where ash suggested a fire had been lit not long ago. Someone lives here, Josh said, though he did not sound convinced. Or did, Tim replied. They argued then, quietly, urgently, about tents, about the woods, about whether a stranger's house was safer than whatever moved unseen beyond the trees. They stepped inside together. The door closed behind them. The fire took easily, as though the house approved of it. Warmth spread unevenly, leaving corners untouched. In a cupboard, they found a bottle of liquor, dark with age but intact. We shouldn't, Tim said. Josh hesitated only a moment, just enough to sleep. Sleep came quickly. Too quickly. Tim woke to the sound of footsteps above them. He lay still, listening. The steps were careful, measured, moving from room to room with purpose. You hear that? Tim nodded. Hello? Josh called. The footsteps stopped. They searched the house. Every room was empty. The candles burned steadily. The door was still closed. When Tim tried the handle, it did not move. They did not panic at first. They sat by the fire. They talked. They joked too loudly. Time passed. Then the whispers began. At first, they were indistinct, no more than breath passing through walls. Then they formed fragments. Laughter, murmured apologies, half-spoken names. Tim, Josh said quietly. It sounds like my sister. Josh's sister passed away a long time ago. The shadows deepened. Doors opened where they had been closed. Windows fogged, though no breath touched them. Cold moved through the house in deliberate paths. They tried to sleep again, but they woke again. No light came through the windows. How long has it been? Josh asked. Tim checked his watch. It had stopped. The house changed subtly. Rooms fell closer together, hallways lengthened. Voices spoke more clearly now.
You can rest,
they said.
There is no morning.
Josh tried to break a window. The glass did not crack. They were terrified beyond belief when the footsteps came close. When dawn did not arrive, they finally understood. Outside, weeks passed. Search parties came and went. The car was found, the campsite. The woods offered nothing else. Those who found the house later found it empty. No fire, no candles. Only the sense that something had recently been awake. People who know the woods speak of a house that appears only when needed. A light between trees, a door already open. And they say that if you see it, you should keep walking. Because inside, the night never ends. And the house remembers everyone who stays. The Ghost Train. Long before the forests reclaimed the valley, a railroad once cut straight through it like a scar of iron. The line ran between dark hills and across a wide basin where fog gathered easily at night. In those days, trains passed through regularly, freight engines hauling timber and coal, passenger cars filled with travelers moving between distant towns. People remembered the sound of those trains more than anything else. The steady thunder of wheels across the valley, the slow hiss of steam drifting over the trees, and the whistle. It could be heard miles away on clear nights, echoing along the slopes like the cry of some enormous mechanical bird. But that was many years ago. The railway was abandoned after a terrible accident late one autumn night, and the small town that once depended on it slowly withdrew into the quiet routine of farms, logging camps, and lonely mountain roads. The depot rotted, the rails rusted, and the forest returned. The town was called Raven Creek. It was not large enough to appear on most maps anymore, but travelers occasionally passed through on their way to other places. The road wound between scattered farmhouses and low hills before disappearing into long stretches of pine forest. Those who lived there rarely spoke about the railroad, yet everyone in Raven Creek knew where the old tracks lay hidden beneath the trees, and most of them avoided that part of the valley after dark. Edward Mallory arrived in Raven Creek on a cold autumn afternoon. He had come on business involving the estate of a distant relative who had owned a small piece of property near the valley. The matter required several signatures and discussions with a local lawyer whose office was little more than a narrow room above the town's general store. The work took longer than Edward expected. By the time the documents were completed, evening shadows had already stretched across the valley floor. Edward had planned to leave town on the evening stagecoach, but a damaged wheel on the road delayed the driver long enough that the coach departed without him. The innkeeper offered him a room for the night. Edward declined. He disliked wasting time in unfamiliar places, and he had been told that another small settlement lay only a few miles beyond the valley. If he walked along the country road, he could reach it before midnight. So he took his lantern and valise and set out alone. At first, the road was clear. Fields spread out on both sides, broken occasionally by split rail fences and small barns leaning in the wind. The last light of day faded beyond the hills, and a pale moon rose slowly above the distant trees. But as Edward walked deeper into the valley, a fog began to form along the ground. It drifted upward from the low marshlands and crept across the fields until the road ahead blurred into a pale gray ribbon. After half an hour, the road reached a fork. One path curved upward into a thick stand of pine trees. The other dipped between two overgrown embankments. Edward hesitated only briefly before choosing the lower road. He walked another 10 minutes before he saw the rusted iron gate. Beyond it lay a narrow cutting through the hillside, and at the bottom of that cutting ran the remains of a railroad track. The rails were nearly hidden beneath moss and fallen leaves. Old wooden ties had cracked and shifted apart. The entire line looked as though it had not been used in decades. To Edward's right stood the remains of a small depot platform. The building itself had long since collapsed, but a narrow shack still stood beside the tracks, and faint light flickered inside its single window. Edward approached the shack and knocked on the door. After several moments, it opened. The man who stood inside was extremely old. His shoulders were bent, his beard white and uneven, and his eyes seemed far too sharp for someone of such advanced age. He held a lantern in one hand and studied Edward carefully before speaking. "You're not from around here," the old man said. "No," Edward replied politely. "I'm afraid I may have taken the wrong road. I was looking for the route to Millstone Crossing." The old man nodded slowly. "You passed it." Edward sighed. "I suspected as much." The man's gaze shifted toward the rails behind him. "You shouldn't be near these tracks tonight," he said quietly. Edward glanced over his shoulder at the rusted line. "Why not?" The old man hesitated. "Because if you hear a whistle," he said at last, "you must not look toward the tracks." Edward allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds like a ghost story." The old man did not smile. "My name is Calder," he said. Edward nodded. "Mallory." Calder studied him a moment longer before pointing toward the gate. "If you leave now and take the road through the pine grove, you'll find your way back to the main road." Edward thanked him and turned to leave. That was when the rails began to hum. At first the sound was faint, a thin vibration beneath Edward's boots. Then the iron trembled more strongly. Edward frowned. "What is that?" Calder's expression changed instantly. "Go," he said. Then the whistle came. It echoed through the fog-covered valley like the cry of something enormous and wounded. Edward froze. Far down the tracks, a dim yellow light appeared in the mist. Another light followed beneath it, then another. The lights grew larger, and slowly, the locomotive emerged from the fog. It was an old steam engine, black, heavy, and gleaming with damp. Smoke poured from its chimney and drifted low across the ground. On the front of the engine, a pale metal plate bore the unmistakable shape of a skull. Behind the locomotive came 3 passenger cars. Their windows glowed faintly with yellow light. The train rolled slowly toward the platform and stopped. One of the carriage doors creaked open. Inside sat passengers. They wore clothing from another era, dark coats, long dresses, stiff collars, but something about them was terribly wrong. They did not move naturally. They did not breathe. The woman nearest the door turned her face toward Edward. Her skin was pale beneath streaks of soot. "You're late," she said softly. Edward stepped backward. Then, every passenger turned toward him at once. Their faces were broken, burned, blood-stained. A child held a torn ticket in small blackened fingers and smiled. Before Edward could run, the conductor stepped down from the train. He was tall and thin, dressed in a long railway coat and cap. His face was colorless and his eyes looked dull and empty. "Ticket, please," the conductor said calmly. I don't have one," Edward stammered. The conductor tilted his head slightly. "That's all right," he said. You've been expected." He seized Edward's arm and pulled him onto the train. The door slammed shut. The whistle sounded again, and the train began to move. Inside the carriage, the passengers sat motionless while the valley slid past the windows. Then Edward looked outside. The landscape had changed. Lanterns flickered along the track. Man shouted in alarm. Smoke rose from twisted iron and broken timber. Another locomotive raced toward them through the fog. Edward understood. He was watching the night of the disaster. The moment when two trains collided on the same track. The passengers turned toward him. "Now you will remember with us," the woman said. The collision came like thunder. Wood shattered, metal screamed, flames burst into the night sky. And Edward Mallory died among them in the wreckage of a disaster that had happened more than 40 years before. The next morning, Calder returned to the abandoned depot. The fog still clung to the valley. The tracks lay silent beneath the trees. There was no sign that a train had passed during the night. But near the platform, he found two things: a shattered lantern and a gentleman's hat. Years passed. The forest continued to swallow the railroad, and the old depot slowly collapsed beneath wind and rain. Travelers rarely came through Raven Creek anymore, but the farms remained scattered across the valley, and the people who lived there knew the forest better than anyone else. They knew how sound traveled through the hills when the fog settled low among the trees. And they knew that sometimes, on cold autumn nights when the moon hung pale above the valley, something still moved along the forgotten railway. No one went to see the tracks after sunset. No one stood beside the old platform anymore. But every now and then, someone would wake in the middle of the night and listen carefully. Because from somewhere deep in the forest, beyond the reach of lantern light or road or town, there sometimes came the long, hollow cry of a steam whistle. And once in a while, you can still hear it blowing through the fog. The Curse of the Ashbourne Hotel. On certain autumn nights, when the fog drifts low over the old roads of northern England, and the moon hangs pale behind a veil of cloud, travelers still speak in hushed voices of a place called the Ashbourne Hotel. Some say it once stood along the coach road just beyond the town of Blackmere, where the land fell into narrow lanes and marshy fields, and the lamps of the nearest houses were no more than distant stars in the mist. Others claim no such road ever existed at all, and that the hotel was never meant to be found except by those already half lost in the darkness. Its name does not appear on modern maps. No carriage route marks its position. No one living can say with certainty where its gates once stood. And yet, from time to time, there are those who swear they have seen it. A tall Victorian building of blackened brick and narrow windows. A lantern burning beside the entrance. Warm, golden light beneath a roofline sharp against the fog. A brass sign over the door, dulled with age, reading simply, Ashbourne Hotel. The last man known to have entered its doors was Edward Harrow. At least, he was the last man anyone ever saw return. Edward was not, by nature, a superstitious man. He was 36 years of age, a writer by profession, and the sort of gentleman whose habits had been shaped more by books than by people. He had spent the better part of 10 years traveling from town to town, collecting local histories, peculiar traditions, and forgotten legends for a volume he intended one day to publish. He preferred old churches to new cities, graveyards to drawing rooms, and innkeepers' tales to academic lectures. It was a solitary life, though not an unhappy one. In late October of 1897, he found himself on the road back from the western countries, having spent several weeks gathering material in remote villages where ancient customs still clung to daily life like ivy to stone walls. The weather had worsened with unusual suddenness. What began as a damp afternoon had, by evening, become a bitter and airless night. The clouds lowered, the wind died. A white, suffocating fog spread over the road. Edward had hired a small carriage that morning and expected to reach Blackmere before dark. Instead, somewhere along the last stretch of country lane, one wheel struck a hidden rut and splintered against a buried stone. The driver, an old man with a heavy scarf wrapped around his neck, climbed down at once and examined the damage with a lantern in his trembling hand. "It's no use, sir," he said after a moment. "The axle's bent. We shan't get much farther tonight." Edward stepped down from the carriage, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The fog had grown so thick that even the horse's head appeared blurred and ghostly. "How far to Blackmere?" 3 miles, perhaps 4. Edward looked into the blank whiteness ahead. "And if I walk?" The driver glanced uneasily along the road. "You might reach it. You might miss the turn entirely. Hard to say in weather like this." Edward had no wish to spend the night half frozen beside a broken carriage. He gathered his bag, wrapped his coat tighter, paid the driver, and set off alone into the fog. At first, the road seemed straightforward enough. The hedges on either side rose like dark walls, dripping with moisture. Gravel crunched softly beneath his boots. Somewhere far off, an owl cried once and then was silent. After 15 minutes, Edward could no longer see behind him. After 20, he could barely see the road ahead. The fog swallowed everything. Trees emerged only when he was upon them. Milestones loomed like grave markers and vanished again. The night seemed to grow quieter with each step, until the world was reduced to the dull thud of his own footsteps and the faint scrape of his breathing in the cold. He pressed on. By the time he began to suspect he had missed the road to Blackmere altogether, the darkness had deepened and the damp had soaked through his gloves. He stopped beneath what he thought was an elm tree and listened. Nothing. No sound of horse or cart, no barking dog, no church bell from any distant village. Then, through the whiteness ahead, he saw a glow. It was so faint at first that he mistook it for a trick of tired eyes. But as he walked toward it, the glow sharpened into a steady amber light of a lantern. And beside it, slowly emerging from the fog, stood a building. Edward halted. It was larger than any roadside inn had a right to be in so remote a place. 4 stories high, perhaps more, with tall black windows, steep gables, and narrow chimneys rising like dark fingers into the moonlit mist. Its brick facade seemed almost swallowed by shadow, yet several windows shone faintly from within. A gas lamp burned near the entrance, casting a pool of gold across wet stone steps. Above the doorway hung a weathered brass sign, Ashbourne Hotel. Edward stared at it with deep relief. Where there was a hotel, there would be warmth, food, and a bed. He mounted the steps and pushed open the door. At once, a wave of warmth met him. The entrance hall beyond was quiet and dimly elegant. A red runner stretched across polished dark wood. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, though only half its lamps were lit. To the left stood a drawing room with a low fire burning in the grate. To the right was a reception desk of carved oak, behind which stood a thin gentleman in a black waistcoat. He looked up the instant Edward entered, as if he had been expecting him. "Good evening, sir," the man said in a calm, measured voice. "Welcome to the Ashbourne Hotel." Edward removed his gloves. "Good evening. I confess I had not expected to find a hotel out here." The gentleman gave a faint smile. "Many of our guests say the same." He was perhaps in his late 50s, with a silver hair parted neatly at the side, a pale face and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to rest upon Edward with unusual steadiness. "My name is Whitmore," he said. "I manage the house." "Edward Harrow." "A pleasure, Mr. Harrow. You have come on a difficult night." "That I have. My carriage broke down on the road. I should be grateful for a room." Mr. Whitmore inclined his head. "Of course. We always have room for travelers who arrive late." The wording struck Edward as slightly odd, though he could not say why. Whitmore turned a large leather-bound register toward him and placed a pen beside it. "If you would be so kind." Edward bent to sign his name. The page was already filled with neat signatures in various hands. He noticed at once that the ink on some entries had faded to a rusty brown. The dates in the margin caught his eye. October 1889, November 1891, December 1878. He paused. Whitmore said quietly, "Is something amiss?" Edward glanced up. "Your register appears to include very old entries." "It is an old house, Mr. Harrow." "Yes, but..." Whitmore's expression did not change. "Our records are kept with great care." Edward, not wishing to seem rude after having requested shelter, signed his name and closed the book. Whitmore handed him a brass key attached to a small oval tag. "Room 12, he said. "Second floor. Dinner is being served in the dining room if you wish it." "I do, thank you." A bellboy did not appear. No servant emerged to take Edward's bag. Whitmore merely stepped aside and gestured toward a staircase beyond the hall. Edward set his bag down at the foot of the stairs and followed the scent of roast meat and wine into the dining room. Only 3 other guests were present. The first was a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in deep blue silk with a high collar and a lace brooch at her throat. Her skin was pale in a way that seemed not delicate but bloodless. She sat very straight and ate little, though her plate had been served. When Whitmore introduced her as Mrs. Caldwell, she inclined her head without smiling. The second was a broad-shouldered gentleman with spectacles and a heavy gray mustache. He introduced himself as Dr. Halverson and spoke in a distracted manner as if his thoughts were elsewhere. When Edward asked how long he had been staying at the hotel, the doctor frowned slightly before answering. "A good while," he said. "A very good while." The third guest sat near the far wall in a dark coat, his chair turned partly from the table. He did not offer his name. He neither ate nor drank. He only stared into the fire with such complete stillness that Edward wondered more than once whether he was asleep with his eyes open. The meal itself was excellent, though strangely silent. The cutlery scarcely clinked. No laughter stirred the room. When Edward attempted conversation, speaking of the weather, the roads, the rising cost of travel, the others listened politely, yet their replies were brief and curiously absent. More than once they seemed not to understand what he meant when he referred to current events. The Jubilee processions in London were remarkable this year, Edward said at one point. Miss Caldwell looked at him with mild confusion. "Which year?" "This year," Edward replied. 97. At that, Dr. Halverson slowly lowered his fog. 97, he repeated. Something in the room changed. Not visibly, not enough to name, yet Edward felt it all the same. A tightening in the silence, as if he had touched upon some subject better left alone. Whitmore appeared at Edward's shoulder with a decanter, though Edward had not heard him enter. "More wine, Mr. Harrow?" "No, thank you." Whitmore set the decanter down and said evenly, "Guests often lose track of time here." Edward gave a short laugh. "I hope I shall not be here long enough for that." Whitmore met his eyes. "One never knows." The phrase, delivered without emphasis, disturbed Edward more than he cared to admit. After dinner, he collected his bag and climbed the stairs to room 12. The corridor on the second floor was narrow and lined with patterned wallpaper gone dark with age. Lamps burned low in wall sconces, casting pools of yellow light that seemed to float in the surrounding gloom. His room lay near the center of the hall and proved comfortable, if old-fashioned. A 4-poster bed, a washstand, a writing desk, a coal fire burning softly in the grate, and curtains of heavy green velvet drawn across the window. Edward unpacked only enough for the night. Before sleeping, he pulled aside the curtains and looked out. There was nothing beyond the glass but fog. No road, no trees, no faint lamps from any village. Only a pale, shifting emptiness pressed close against the pane, reflecting back the ghostly outline of his room. He let the curtain fall and prepared for bed. Sometime after midnight, he awoke. At first, he did not know what had disturbed him. He lay still beneath the blankets, listening. The fire had burned low. The room was cold. Then he heard it. Footsteps in the corridor. Soft, slow, measured. Not the brisk tread of a servant or the uncertain shuffle of a late guest, but the unhurried step of someone walking with deliberate purpose. The sound passed his door, paused, then continued toward the far end of the corridor. Edward rose, drew his dressing gown, and opened the door. The hall was empty. He stepped out and looked both ways. The lamps guttered in their sconces, throwing long shadows across the wallpaper. Then at the far end of the passage, he saw her. A woman in a gray Victorian dress, one hand trailing lightly along the wall as she walked toward the staircase. Her hair was pinned high, old-fashioned even by provincial standards, and her head was bowed slightly as if in grief. Edward opened his mouth to speak. She reached the top of the stairs and vanished. Not turned the corner, not descended. Vanished. Edward stood rooted to the spot, cold moving through his limbs. A lamp hissed softly overhead. Somewhere below, a clock ticked once, then stopped. He closed his door with great care and did not sleep again until dawn. Morning brought little comfort. Though the room showed signs of daylight, the fog beyond the window remained almost as thick as before. Edward dressed quickly and went downstairs, intending to leave after breakfast. Whatever oddness the Ashbourne Hotel possessed, he had no desire to linger and study it more closely. When he entered the lobby, he found the great clock above the mantel had stopped at 11:55. He frowned and looked at his pocket watch. 9:20. Mr. Whitmore stood behind the desk, immaculate as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Harrow." "Your clock has stopped." "Yes." "Has no one wound it?" Whitmore folded his hands. "It has no need of winding." Edward waited for further explanation. None came. "I should like breakfast," he said. "It is served." Breakfast was laid in the dining room exactly as dinner had been. Silver service, fine china, warm food, and a silence that seemed to deepen rather than lessen in daylight. Mrs. Caldwell was there again, hands folded beside her untouched teacup. Dr. Halverson sat reading a newspaper so old that the paper had yellowed to brown. Edward took his seat. "Good morning." They nodded. After a pause, Edward said, "I intend to resume my journey today once the fog clears." Mrs. Caldwell turned her pale eyes toward him. "Does it clear?" she asked. Edward smiled faintly. "Fog always clears." Dr. Halverson lowered his newspaper and regarded him over the rims of his spectacles with something close to pity. "Not here," he said. Edward set down his cup. "What exactly does that mean?" But the doctor had already turned back to the paper. Frustrated, Edward finished his meal and resolved to leave at once whether the weather improved or not. He took his bag, crossed the lobby, and opened the front door. There was no road outside. No carriage tracks, no hedges, no stone steps leading to a lane. Only fog. It pressed so close and thick beyond the threshold that it seemed almost solid. The hotel might have stood on the edge of an abyss for all that could be seen past the door. Edward stepped forward cautiously, extending one foot beyond the stone. The instant he did so, a terrible dizziness seized him. The whiteness before him deepened into a blank and depthless void. He staggered back at once, hard hammering, and the sensation vanished. He shut the door. Behind him, Whitmore's voice said, "I would advise against wandering too far in weather like this." Edward turned sharply. "Where is the road?" Whitmore regarded him calmly. "Outside?" "There is nothing outside." "There is always something outside, Mr. Harrow." Edward stared at him. "What sort of answer is that?" "The only honest one." Edward left the lobby without replying. He spent the next several hours exploring the hotel in mounting unease. The ground floor contained the dining room, drawing room, reception hall, and a library deep within the building. The upper floors held long corridors of guest rooms, though many doors were locked and several bore no numbers. He heard no sound of servants, no maids made beds, no porters carried trunks, no housekeepers swept ashes from the grates. Yet everything remained impossibly clean, as if maintained by unseen hands. The library drew him at last. It was a narrow room, lined floor to ceiling with books, though many were local histories, railway guides, sermons, and outdated almanacs. Dust lay thick upon the highest shelves, but curiously thin upon the desk near the window. Edward began to search the cabinets and drawers, driven less by reason than by a growing instinct that the hotel was withholding something from him. In a lower drawer of the desk, he found a packet of old newspapers tied with ribbon. The topmost was dated November 4th, 1893. His eyes moved at once to a headline on the front page. "Tragic fire claims dozens at Ashbourne Hotel." Edward read the article standing where he found it. It described a fire that began shortly after midnight, spreading through the lower floors of the Ashbourne Hotel before the town brigade could arrive. Owing to the destiny of the fog that night and the speed of the blaze, no one within had escaped. The proprietor, Mr. Elias Whitmore, several members of staff, 21 guests, all dead. Edward read it twice. Then he looked again at the date, 1893, 4 years earlier. He searched the packet for more. There were follow-up accounts, inquiries into the fire, speculations about the faulty lamps, list of the dead. He found names that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, Dr. Henrik Halverson. And among the dead was one unnamed gentleman described only as a commercial traveler in dark attire, identity uncertain. Edward lowered the papers slowly. The room seemed suddenly colder than before. He hurried from the library and nearly collided with Miss Caldwell in the corridor beyond. Up close, her face appeared waxen, the skin fine and dry as paper. "Forgive me," Edward said, stepping back. She looked at the newspaper in his hand and seemed, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely sad. "You should not have found those yet," she said softly. Edward stared at her. "Yet?" Her gaze drifted past him toward the library. "Some of us waited longer." "Mrs. Caldwell, what is this place?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, Whitmore appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you are needed in the drawing room." At once her expression emptied. She inclined her head and moved past Edward without another word. Whitmore approached with his usual composed step. "I see you have been reading." Edward thrust the newspaper toward him. "This hotel burned down in 1893. Whitmore glanced at the page only briefly. "Yes." Edward felt a chill more terrible than any he had yet known. "Then what is this place?" Whitmore folded his hands behind his back. "It is the Ashbourne Hotel." "Do not answer me in riddles." "I do not speak in riddles, Mr. Harrow. I speak as plainly as I am able." "You died in that fire." Whitmore's eyes did not leave Edward's face. "Yes." For several moments, neither man moved. Edward heard the blood beating in his ears. "This is impossible." Whitmore gave the faintest shadow of a smile. "And yet, here you are." Edward backed away. "I'm leaving." Whitmore's expression did not alter. "You may try." That evening, the hotel changed. Until then, all its strangeness had existed at the edge of certainty. The old register, the silent guests, the stopped clock, the impossible articles. But as the daylight faded, if indeed it was daylight beyond the fog, the Ashbourne Hotel seemed to shed what little remained of ordinary appearance. The lamps burned lower, though no one touched them. Cold seeped through the corridors, not like winter air, but like something drawn up from underground vaults. Shadows thickened in the corners. At times, Edward thought he heard distant voices behind the walls, too soft to make out, as though conversations from other centuries were murmuring just beneath the plaster. He locked himself in room 12 and sat fully dressed on the bed, listening. At some hour he could not measure, there came a sound from the passage outside. Not footsteps now, but many footsteps. Slow, coordinated, ascending the stairs. Edward rose and went to the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then, very softly, from the opposite side, came a woman's voice. "Do not open it." He stepped back. "Mrs. Caldwell?" he whispered. No reply. Another voice followed, lower and rougher. Dr. Halverson. "When the clock moves, it is too late." Edward turned toward the mantel. The room's small carriage clock, which had not worked when he entered, now ticked faintly. Once, twice. He snatched up his bag and threw open the door. The corridor was empty, but the lamps had dimmed to little more than embers behind clouded glass. At the far end, the staircase descended into darkness. He did not go down at once. Instead, he turned toward the rear corridor he had not yet fully explored and hurried past unnumbered doors until he came upon a section of the hotel that seemed older than the rest. The wallpaper had blistered away here, exposing blackened plaster beneath. The air smelled faintly of smoke. At the very end of the passage stood a door with no handle. Set into the panel at eye level was a strip of dark glass, as though once it had allowed someone to look through from the other side. From behind it came a sound like breathing. Edward recoiled. The clock in his room ticked again somewhere behind him, impossibly loud. He ran. Down the stairs, through the hall, into the lobby. The great clock above the mantel, stopped at 11:55 since his arrival, had begun to move. Its minute hand trembled upward. 11:56. In the drawing room beyond, the other guests had gathered. Mrs. Caldwell stood beside the mantel, her face filled now not with emptiness, but with terror. Dr. Halverson stared at the clock as though he had seen this moment many times before. The dark-coated gentleman stood in the corner with his head bowed. "What happens at midnight?" Edward demanded. No one answered. Whitmore stood at the reception desk, hands resting lightly upon the wood. "The same thing that always happens," he said. Edward crossed the lobby in 3 strides and seized him by the collar. "And this!" Whitmore neither flinched nor resisted. "I cannot." Edward shook him. "Then tell me how to leave." Whitmore spoke with grave patience. When the fire came, the guests were trapped. The windows would not open. The doors were lost behind smoke. Some burned where they stood. Some hid in their rooms. Some reached the halls only to find them filled with flame. They died frightened, confused, and unready. Edward released him slowly. Whitmore continued. Something remained afterward. The shape of the house. The memory of those within it. The need. What need? Whitmore looked toward the clock. To be occupied. 11:57. "The hotel cannot stand empty," Whitmore said. "It draws in those who are lost, those who arrive late, those who have nowhere else to go." Edward backed away. "No." "You signed the register." "That is nothing." "It is how the house knows your name." A burst of cold air swept through the lobby, though the doors were shut. In the walls there came a faint crackling sound, like fire catching. Edward turned and ran to the front entrance. He flung the doors wide. Fog. Endless, white, lightless fog. He forced himself across the threshold. For 1 second he felt solid ground beneath his boots. For the next, nothing. A vast, empty drop seemed to yawn beneath him. He staggered, lurched backward, and fell hard on the lobby floor as the doors slammed shut of their own accord. From above came a sound that chilled him utterly. Coughing. Dozens of voices coughing at once. The staircase filled slowly with figures. They emerged from the upper corridor and descended with dreadful calm. Men and women in clothes from other age, their faces pale, their eyes dark-rimmed, their skin marked in places by soot and burns. Some carried the posture of guests roused from sleep. Others looked as though they had been wandering for years without rest. Their mouths were closed, yet the sound of distant coughing seemed to come from them all. Mrs. Caldwell covered her face with trembling hands. Dr. Halverson whispered, "Again." Edward scrambled to his feet. "No," he said, though there was no force left in the word. The descending figures filled the stairs and spread across the landing. Whitmore spoke quietly behind him. "You must understand, Mr. Harrow. It is not malice. It is hunger, memory, habit. A house does what it was made to do." "A house?" Edward turned on him. "This is not a house." Whitmore's pale features tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was once." The first of the burned guests stepped off the stairs into the lobby. A woman in a charred evening gown. A boy of no more than 14 clutching a melted toy soldier. A man whose beard had burned away on one side of his face. They moved not toward Whitmore, nor toward the others who belonged to the place, but toward Edward. He ran. Through the drawing room, overturning a chair, into the dining room where the silver laid upon the tables had gone black with soot. Through a swinging door into service passages behind the walls. Every hallway seemed longer than before. Every turn led to another passage, another staircase, another locked door. The hotel had become a maze assembled out of itself. Smoke drifted along the ceiling now, thin at first, then thicker. He wrapped his scarf over his mouth and plunged downward into the cellar. The steps ended in a stone corridor lined with wine racks and coal bins. Somewhere ahead a red glow flickered. Edward stopped. From the darkness came the faint crackle of flames and the smell of burning varnish. He backed away at once, turned another corner, and found himself staring into the lobby. Impossible though it was, he had circled back. The burned guests stood where he had left them, waiting. The great clock read 11:59. Edward's mind, driven to a terrible clarity by panic, seized upon one last hope: the library. If the hotel was memory, perhaps it could be undone by truth. If the fire had begun in some part of the building, perhaps there remained some physical center to the haunting, some place, some object, some source. He fled once more, this time to the library, and slammed the door behind him. The room trembled faintly. Books had fallen from the shelves. The newspapers lay scattered across the floor. The lamp on one desk burned with a long, wavering flame. Edward searched wildly through drawers, cabinets, shelves. At last, in a locked compartment already half broken, he found a ledger not of a guest, but of accounts and correspondence. Folded between its pages was a letter, smoke-stained and never sent. It was from Elias Whitmore, written on the evening of the fire. Edward's eyes raced over the lines. There had been death, severe death. Whitmore had concealed it from the investors and delayed repairs to the gas pipes and wiring throughout the lower floors. He wrote of one final season and the house surviving this winter if fortune holds. Beneath the measured language ran desperation, shame, and a desperate love for the hotel itself, spoken of almost as if it were a living companion. "I have given my life," the letter read, "and perhaps it will take what remains." The lamp beside Edward flared high. Midnight struck. Not from any visible clock, but through the whole hotel at once. A deep, resonant toll rolled through walls, floor, and ceiling. The lamp exploded. The library plunged into darkness, lit only by a red glow seeping beneath the door. Edward threw it open. The corridor beyond was aflame. Not wholly, not naturally. Patches of old fire burned in the wallpaper, in the runner, along the ceiling beams, yet gave off little heat. Through those flames moved the pale shapes of guests and servants alike, each reliving the final horror of 1893. Some staggered coughing through smoke, some beat at locked doors. Some pressed themselves against walls as if seeking escape routes that no longer existed. And all of them, again and again, turned toward Edward. He understood then. The hotel was not simply trapping souls. It was repeating its death, consuming it endlessly, and drawing in the living to complete the memory. Every new guest renewed the pattern. Another name in the book, another witness, another keeper of the rooms. He clutched Whitmore's unsent letter and forced his way back toward the lobby through heatless flame and crowds of the dead. Whitmore stood beneath the great clock as before, though now his waistcoat was blackened, his face streaked with soot, his hair singed at the temples. The polite illusion had dropped away. At last, Edward saw the man not as manager, but as one more ghost among ghosts. "You knew," Edward said hoarsely. Whitmore inclined his head. "Yes." "You caused it." Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Edward held up the letter. "Then end it." Whitmore looked at the paper in his hand with an expression so old and tired that Edward, for one brief and dreadful moment, almost pitied him. "If confession were enough," Whitmore said, "it could have ended years ago." "Then what?" Whitmore's gaze shifted to the register upon the desk. "The house must let go." "How?" Whitmore answered in a whisper. "It has never wished to." The burned guests were gathering again, filling the edges of the lobby. Mrs. Caldwell stood among them now, no longer apart. Dr. Halverson removed his spectacles with shaking fingers and put them in his pocket as though preparing for some final procedure. The dark-coated gentleman lifted his head for the first time, and Edward saw the ruin of flame across his throat. The clock's minute hand trembled past midnight. Whitmore looked at Edward with something like sorrow. "It needs a host." Edward understood too late. He lunged for the register, meaning to tear it apart, to cast it into the fire, to do anything that might break the cycle. But the instant his fingers touched the leather cover, the hotel seemed to shudder in relief. The flames died, the smoke thinned, the coughing ceased. The lobby returned to its earlier stillness, though now the silence was deeper and more absolute than before. The great clock stopped. 12 o'clock. Edward tried to pull his hand away from the register and could not. A numb cold traveled from his fingertips to his wrist, then up his arm. Names filled his vision, not only those in the book, but countless others spoken nowhere, yet kept within the walls. He saw every arrival, every late knock at the door, every frightened face lifting in gratitude at the sight of the lamp outside. He saw Whitmore welcoming them all. He saw himself doing the same. "No," he whispered. Whitmore stepped forward. His features were already fading, as if light were being withdrawn from behind them. "It is done," he said. "What have you done to me?" "Only what was once done to me." One by one, the other guests began to recede, not walking away, but thinning like breath on glass. Mrs. Caldwell gave Edward a final look, almost kind. Dr. Halverson bowed his head. The burned guests upon the stairs dissolved into shadow. Whitmore, too, was vanishing. Edward reached for him. "Wait!" Whitmore's voice came faint and distant. "Be polite to those who arrive. They are always tired, always cold. It is the least we can do." And then he was gone. Edward stood alone in the lobby of the Ashbourne Hotel. The register lay open beneath his hand. The ink of his own signature glistened wetly upon the page, though he had signed it the previous night. Beneath it, new lines appeared in blank space as if waiting patiently for names not yet written. He tried the front door once more. This time it opened onto a proper road, bordered by hedges silvered with moonlight. The fog had lifted just enough to show the lane stretching away into darkness. Hope struck him so violently he nearly cried aloud. He ran down the steps, and at once found himself not on the road, but standing inside the lobby again. Hand upon the doorknob, the door only half open. He shut it slowly. He tried the back entrance, the cellar passage, a window in the drawing room, a door on the third floor that opened onto a narrow iron balcony. Every exit promised freedom. Every exit returned him to the hotel. Hours passed, or perhaps moments. Time inside the Ashbourne no longer obeyed any instrument he possessed. At last he sat behind the reception desk, exhausted beyond thought, staring at the brass key to room 12 lying before him. Somewhere in the house a bell rang, not loud, not urgent. The small bell once used to summon the manager to the desk. Edward lifted his head. From beyond the front door came the muffled sound of footsteps on wet stone. Then a knock. 3 soft raps. He knew with the calm certainty of nightmare that someone stood outside in the fog, tired, cold, relieved to have found shelter. His mouth went dry. He remained seated, hoping absurdly that silence might drive the traveler away. The knock came again. Then, against all his will, Edward rose. He crossed the lobby, straightened his coat, opened the door. A gentleman stood upon the step, hat wet with mist, a valise in one hand. Behind him the road lay pale and empty beneath the moon. "Good evening," the stranger said. "I beg your pardon. My carriage broke down on the road, and I fear I am quite lost. Have you a room for the night?" Edward felt words gathering in his throat like water finding a long carved channel. He tried to resist them. He could not. "Good evening, sir," he heard himself say in a voice calm and measured, a voice that no longer sounded entirely his own. "Welcome to the Ashbourne Hotel." The stranger smiled in relief. Edward stepped aside. The man entered. And somewhere high above, behind the black windows of the upper floors, pale figures gathered soundlessly in the lamplight to watch. The Churchyard Bell. At the far edge of the old English town of Grimshaw, where the last crooked street fades into fields of mist, stands the ancient church of St. Bartholomew's. Its stone tower rises above the rooftops like a silent sentinel, and beside it lies a churchyard so old that no one in Grimshaw remembers when the first grave was dug there. The gravestones lean at odd angles. Many of the names carved into them have long since faded. But the people of Grimshaw still remember one thing: the bell. It is said that the bell of St. Bartholomew's must never ring at midnight under a full moon, because when it does, the dead come from their graves. And before the night is over, one living soul will be taken back beneath the earth. On the night Daniel O'Brien returned to Grimshaw, the moon hung full and pale above the town. He had been gone many years, long enough that the narrow streets felt unfamiliar and the houses smaller than he remembered. But one place had not changed. The Black Lantern Tavern still stood near the market square, its warm light spilling out onto the cobblestones. Inside the tavern was crowded with locals gathered around the fireplace. The air smelled of smoke and ale, and quiet conversation filled the room. Daniel ordered a drink and listened. It did not take long for someone to notice the moon outside. One of the men by the fire leaned toward the window and frowned. "Full moon tonight," he muttered. The words seemed to quiet the room. An elderly man sitting nearby turned slowly toward Daniel. "You're not from around here anymore, are you?" Daniel smiled politely. "I grew up here." The old man studied him for a moment. "Then you must remember the churchyard bell." Daniel chuckled softly. "I remember the stories, yes." Several people in the tavern exchanged uneasy glances. The old man's expression did not change. "Stories," he repeated. Daniel lifted his glass. "Ghost tales to frighten children." The old man leaned closer, lowering his voice. "They're not tales?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. The man continued quietly. "When the bell of St. Bartholomew's rings at midnight under a full moon, the dead rise from their graves. They walk the churchyard until they find what they're looking for." Daniel took another drink. "And what's that?" The old man's eyes were dark and serious. "One living soul." The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed. Daniel laughed. "You expect me to believe that?" The old man did not smile. "Believe what you like," he said. Then he leaned closer and added softly, "But pray it doesn't learn your name." Later that night, Daniel stepped outside the tavern. The streets of Grimshaw were strangely quiet. Most of the windows were dark. Doors were locked, curtains drawn. It was as though the entire town had gone to sleep earlier than usual. Above the rooftops, the tower of St. Bartholomew's Church rose against the moonlit sky. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. The old man's words echoed faintly in his mind. Then he shook his head and smiled. Superstitious nonsense. Still, curiosity has a way of growing stronger in the silence of the night. Before long, Daniel found himself walking toward the edge of town. The streets grew narrower, the houses fewer, until finally the road opened onto the small hill where the church stood. The churchyard gate waited there, black and crooked against the pale moonlight. Daniel pushed it open. The iron hinges groaned softly. Inside the churchyard, a thin mist drifted slowly between the gravestones. The ground was uneven with age. Old stones leaned sideways like tired sentinels watching the passing centuries. The church tower loomed overhead. Daniel walked among the graves, reading the names and dates. Some stones were so worn that only faint traces of letters remained. Others were newer. One grave near the center of the yard caught his attention. The stone looked strangely fresh compared to the others. Daniel brushed away the thin layer of moss that covered its surface. The moment he read the name, his smile vanished. Carved into the stone were the words, Daniel O'Brien. Daniel stared at it. Below the name there was space for a date, but no date had been carved. Just a blank line beneath his name. For a moment Daniel said nothing. Then he laughed quietly. Very funny. Someone must have carved it as a joke. Still, the sound of his laughter seemed strangely small in the empty churchyard. Daniel glanced up toward the tower. Through the broken window near the top, he could see the bell rope hanging down in darkness. It swayed slowly, back and forth. Daniel frowned. There was no wind. The rope twisted gently as if touched by an unseen hand. Then it stopped. The graveyard fell completely silent. A moment later, the church clock began to strike midnight. 1, 2, 3. Daniel watched the bell rope. It hung perfectly still. Then the first deep toll of the bell rolled out across the churchyard. Daniel's eyes widened. The rope had not moved. Yet the bell continued to ring. 4, 5, 6. Each toll echoed across the silent graves. By the time the 12th bell sounded, Daniel felt the air around him grow colder. Then, the ground began to move. At first it was only a faint sound, the shifting of loose soil, the scraping of stone. Daniel looked down. The earth beside one of the graves was trembling. The cracked stone lid slowly tilted aside. A pale hand pushed its way through the soil. Daniel stumbled backward. More graves began to move. The ground opened in dozens of places. From the earth rose figures gray with decay and dust. They were not skeletons, not quite corpses. Something between the two. The dead. They climbed slowly from their graves, standing motionless among the crooked stones. Then, one by one, their hollow eyes turned toward Daniel. He began backing toward the gate. The figures started walking, slowly, silently. Mist curled around their feet as they moved. Daniel turned and ran. He reached the iron gate and pulled. It would not open. He pulled harder. The metal bars felt frozen in place. Behind him, the footsteps of the dead scraped softly among the gravel paths. A whisper drifted through the mist.
Daniel.
He froze. Another voice followed.
Daniel O'Brien.
More voices joined the first, low, hollow, repeating his name. The dead were calling him. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. They knew who he was. They had known all along. Daniel tried climbing the gate. His hands barely reached the top when cold fingers seized his ankle. He kicked wildly. More hands reached out from the mist. Gray faces stared up at him with empty eyes. The ground beneath the graves began to open again. Daniel screamed as the dead dragged him down. Their hands pulled him into the cold soil. The earth closed above him. High above the churchyard, the bell rang once more. A single, hollow toll. Then silence returned to Grimshaw. At dawn, the townspeople approached the churchyard. They did not speak. They simply walked among the graves until they reached the fresh mound of earth near the center. A wooden mark had already been placed there. Carved into the wood were the words, Daniel O'Brien. Beneath the name was the date of his death. And high in the tower of St. Bartholomew's, the bell rope swayed gently in the morning breeze, as though someone unseen had just let go. Whispers at Ravenhill. The village of Harrowfield sat quietly in a narrow valley where the hills pressed close and the fog lingered long after sunrise. To travelers, it seemed like many other English villages. Stone cottages, a small bridge crossing a shallow stream, and an old road that curved gently through fields of grass and dark hedgerows. But above the village stood a place the locals avoided, a lonely rise known as Ravenhill. The hill was crowned by the ruined chapel of St. Leonora, a small gray structure that had long since fallen out of use. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side, its roof tiles had begun to slip, and the graveyard surrounding it had grown wild with thistle and creeping moss. Even in daylight, the place felt abandoned. But it was not the broken chapel that kept the villagers away. It was the whispers. Those who lived in Harrowfield said the fog that rolled down Ravenhill at night carried voices. Most insisted the sounds were only wind slipping through the broken stonework of the chapel. But sometimes, when the mist lay thick upon the fields and the moon climbed high above the hill, the whispers could be heard clearly. Not wind, not echoes. Voices. And sometimes, those voices spoke names. Dr. Arthur Blackwood arrived in Harrowfield on a cool autumn evening. He was a historian by profession and a collector of old legends by inclination. For years he had traveled through quiet villages and forgotten towns, recording strange tales that clung to the edges of history like shadows. The story of Ravenhill had reached him through the passing reference in a church archive, a chapel abandoned, a sealed crypt, and reports of whispers drifting from the hill during heavy fog. To Blackwood, it sounded like nothing more than folklore. But folklore, he often said, was where truth and imagination met. And he intended to discover which of the two lived on Ravenhill. His first evening in the village brought him to the only inn Harrowfield possessed. It was called the Widow's Lantern, and its owner, Matthew Marlowe, proved a talkative man once the fire was warm and the ale was poured. Blackwood asked casually about the hill. Marlowe's expression changed almost immediately. "You mean the chapel?" "Yes," Blackwood replied. "St. Lenora's, I believe." Marlowe leaned his elbows on the counter and spoke quietly. "That place has been empty near 200 years. "Why?" Marlowe hesitated before answering. "There was sickness here once. Bad sickness. People died faster than they could be buried. The cemetery filled in days." Blackwood listened with growing interest. "They began placing bodies in the crypt beneath the chapel floor until graves could be dug," Marlowe continued. "But some folks said the dead weren't as dead as the doctor claimed." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "What happened then?" Marlowe's voice dropped even further. "People started hearing scratching under the chapel." Blackwood did not laugh, but he smiled faintly. "The crypt was sealed not long after," Marlowe said. "And the whispers?" Blackwood asked. The innkeeper looked toward the dark window behind the bar. "Some say they're still trying to get out." The next morning, Blackwood spoke with Elliot White, one of the oldest men in Harrowfield. White lived in a small cottage near the road leading toward Ravenhill. His back was bent with age, and his hands were rough with years of farming. When Blackwood mentioned the whispers, the old man shook his head slowly. "I've heard them," White said. "When?" "Most nights, when the fog rolls down." "Voices?" White nodded. "Soft ones, like people speaking through dirt." Blackwood asked if anyone had ever investigated. "Once or twice," White said. "And?" The old man met his eyes. "They stopped climbing the hill after." Later that day, Blackwood met the chapel caretaker. Margaret Hargreaves was a stern woman in her 50s who carried the keys to St. Lenora's chapel and occasionally climbed Ravenhill to keep the cemetery from vanishing beneath weeds. She unlocked the chapel door for him. The interior smelled of damp stone and dust. Sunlight slipped through the narrow windows, illuminating crooked pews and a faded altar at the far end of the room. Margaret spoke quietly. "The whispers are strongest here." Blackwood looked around curiously. "Where exactly?" She pointed toward the altar. "Beneath the floor." Blackwood knelt and pressed his ear against the cold stone. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then, a faint murmur. So soft he might have imagined it. He looked up sharply. Margaret's face had gone pale. "I told you," she said. "Do not come back here after sunset." But curiosity is a difficult thing to silence. That evening, Blackwood climbed Ravenhill again. The fog had begun rolling down from the forest beyond the hilltop, curling through the graveyard like pale smoke. The chapel stood silent against the moonlit sky. At first, the hill seemed empty. Then the whispers began. Soft murmuring, broken words.
Cold. Dark.
Blackwood followed the sound toward the chapel. The whispers grew louder near the altar. He knelt again, pressing his ear against the stone floor. The voices were clearer now. Not wind, not imagination. People speaking beneath the ground. Then the graveyard moved. Behind him, the soil shifted. Blackwood turned slowly. One of the graves near the chapel had begun to crack. The earth trembled as something pushed upward from below. A gray hand burst through the dirt. Another followed. Slowly, horribly, a shape dragged itself out of the grave. The creature that emerged had once been human, but death had changed it. Its skin hung loose and gray. Its mouth opened in a crooked snarl. And its eyes glowed faintly in the fog. Blackwood stumbled backward. The thing lurched toward him with stiff, unnatural movements, like a corpse that had forgotten how to walk. The whispers beneath the ground rose suddenly. Dozens of voices speaking at once.
Let us out.
The creature reached for him. Blackwood ran. He burst through the chapel door and slammed it behind him. For several seconds he stood trembling in the darkness. Then the whispering changed. It was no longer beneath the floor. Now it came from the chapel itself, from the shadows around him. The air grew cold. The fog seeped slowly through the broken windows, and something moved within it. A shape began forming near the altar. Tall, thin, wrong. Blackwood could not see its face clearly, but he felt its gaze upon him. Then it spoke. The voice was deep, layered, like many voices speaking through one throat.
Another listener.
Blackwood's heart pounded. The shape stepped closer. The fog around it twisted like living smoke.
2 centuries they have whispered beneath my hill.
The voice continued. Blackwood forced himself to speak. What are you? The thing laughed softly.
A memory.
The shadows shifted again. Faces appeared briefly within the fog surrounding it. Men, women, children, all silent, all trapped.
They fed me with their fear.
The creature said.
The buried ones, the forgotten ones.
Blackwood realized the truth with horror. You kept them trapped.
I keep them useful.
The creature leaned closer.
Do you hear them still, Doctor?
Blackwood heard the whispers again beneath the chapel floor. Hundreds of voices crying out. The demon spoke one final time.
Listen long enough, and you will join them.
Blackwood fled the chapel before dawn. He left Harrowfield the next morning. But villagers say the whispers have grown louder since that night. Some evenings the fog carries new voices down the hill. Voices that sound unfamiliar. Voices that sound frightened. And sometimes, when the moon is bright and the mist is thick, travelers passing the road beneath Ravenhill swear they hear a voice whispering clearly from the fog. A desperate voice, calling for help. Calling for someone to open the crypt. Calling the name of a historian who once came to Harrowfield in search of the truth. Dr. Arthur Blackwood. The Ghost in the Attic. They had met, as quiet people often do, not in the bright commotion of parties, but in the gentle repetition of ordinary days. At the same bookshop counter, beneath the same dripping awning on a rainy afternoon, within the steady exchange of small kindnesses. In time, affection settled into certainty, and certainty into love. They returned to their rented rooms with a single shared intention: to find a home that did not shout at the soul. Peter and Sally were not the sort of couple who mistook noise for life. The city had never been cruel to them, but it was relentless. Its streets breathed hot breath in summer and spat black slush in winter. Its clocks governed every act. Even in silence, it seemed to insist upon being heard. So when money grew tight, as it often does for those beginning to build something of their own, they did what sensible dreamers do. They looked outward, away from the rush toward the countryside and its old, unhurried air. They traveled on a day that carried the faint perfume of cut grass and damp stone. The road unwound through fields where sheep stood like pale thoughts against the green, and hedgerows stitched the land together with thorn and leaf. Low hills rose and fell with the slow confidence of things that had never needed to hurry. Here and there, honey-colored cottages leaned companionably toward one another, their windows dark and calm, their roofs thick with moss. They said very little as they drove. Peter held the wheel with steady caution of a man who did not waste effort on bravado. Sally sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze drifting over the fields as though her eyes might find, somewhere among those gentle slopes, the outline of their future. It was Sally who saw the house first. They had been passing through a small village, no more than a clustered handful of buildings around a green, when she asked him to slow. "There," she said softly. At the far edge of the village, where the last cottage surrendered to open land, stood an old Victorian house behind an iron gate. It was larger than the cottages, taller too, and built of the same warm stone that made the village appear as though it had been carved from sunlight. Yet the house did not share the village's friendliness. It held itself apart, set back from the road behind a small front garden that had long ago ceased to be a garden and had become instead a tangle of nettle and bramble. A sign leaned crookedly on two posts in the front yard. For sale. The letters were faded. The board had been there a long time. The house itself had the look of something once cherished and then forgotten, like a portrait left face down in an attic. Its windows were tall. their panes filled with dust. Ivy had claimed the lower walls and had begun greedily to climb. The roofline was steep, and beneath its dark slates, the uppermost story sat in shadow. Sally's gaze fixed there, at the eaves, at the narrow band of darkness under the roof, and for a moment Peter thought he saw her shiver. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's empty," Peter replied. He glanced at her, but she was still watching the house. In the quiet that followed, Peter felt something he could not have named aloud. A sense of being observed. It came and went like the touch of a cold fingertip, leaving behind no evidence but unease. They continued on, yet Sally said, almost as if she had already decided it, "Let's call." The agent met them 2 days later. He was a man in a good coat, with a thin smile, polite, brisk, and faintly preoccupied, as though his mind contained a list of obligations more urgent than the one before him. He introduced himself, unlocked the iron gate, and led them up the weed-choked path. "You'll have to forgive the state of the ground," he said, stepping over a broken pot that had once held flowers. "The property has been unoccupied for some years. Hard to find a buyer for the house of this character." "Why has it been empty?" Sally asked. The agent's smile tightened by a degree. "Family complications," he said, as though the phrase were meant to close the matter. "No one's lived here since the owners passed on." Peter reached the front door and found it swollen in its frame. The agent produced an old key and forced it with a practiced shoulder. When the door opened, a breath of air came out, cold and stale, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like rainwater trapped beneath stone. Inside, the entrance hall was wide and shadowed. A staircase rose at the far end, its banister carved and dark with age. A chandelier hung above like a dead spider. Wallpaper peeled in the corners. Yet, even in the neglect, the house retained a certain dignity, as though it had once been the stage for a quieter, more careful life. Sally walked slowly, trailing her fingers along the banister. Peter followed, cautious, measuring the cracked plaster and the sagging floorboards with the eye of a man already calculating costs. The agent spoke of solid bones and original features. He pointed out the fireplace, the deep window seats, the high ceilings. He mentioned the roof needed attention, the kitchen would require a full refit, the garden was a project. His voice kept to practicalities, as if he feared that any pause might invite something else into the room. Then Sally, standing in the sitting room, looked up. "Is there an attic?" she asked. The agent blinked as though surprised by the question. "There is a loft space," he said. "Nothing of use, no access as far as I know." Peter glanced around. The ceilings were high, but the top floor, what of it? There were 2 bedrooms above, a narrow study, a small washroom. He had noticed no stair beyond that. Sally continued to gaze upward, listening. Peter listened too, and heard only the old house settling, a faint creak, the whisper of wood. Still, the unease returned. It felt for the briefest moment as though something moved above them. The agent clapped his hands lightly as if to scatter the silence. "So," he said, "shall we talk numbers?" They did, there in the cold sitting room where dust floated in the weak light like pale ghosts of its own. The price was almost impossible. Peter frowned, suspicious. Sally, against her usual reverse, looked almost radiant. It was affordable. It was real. It was a chance. And when you are young and newly in love and the future is a thin thing you must hold with both hands, chances like that do not come without a catch, but you do not always ask where it is hidden. They signed the papers within a fortnight. A month later, they moved in. The first week was all labor and light. They opened curtains that had not been drawn in years and watched sun spill across dusty floors. They scrubbed the kitchen until the stone counters regained their color. They washed windows and found the garden's reflection in the glass. A wild ruin, yes, but theirs. They slept in one room with the mattress on the floor while the rest of the house stood around them, empty and echoing. Peter took to the repairs with a steady, determined optimism. He mended cracked boards. He patched holes. He rehung a door that dragged against its frame. The house responded, if not kindly, then at least with silence. Sally painted. She chose pale colors for the walls, soft tones meant to coax warmth into the rooms. She hummed to herself as she worked, her voice small but steady, and the sound of it, human, living, seemed to change the air. For a time they believed their luck had been genuine. The next day, Sally came down for breakfast and found every cabinet door in the kitchen open. Everyone. The sight of it, dark mouths gaping, made her pause in the doorway with her heart suddenly thudding. Peter, behind her, frowned. "Draft," he said. "Old hinges." Sally did not answer. She had looked at the cabinets, and in that instant she had felt, not heard, not seen, but felt a presence behind her shoulder, as if someone stood close enough to breathe. She turned quickly. Nothing. Only the empty hall and the staircase rising into shadow. That evening, when the light outside began to thin, they heard the first sound from beneath the roof. It was not loud. It was not even distinct. It was a slow, dragging step across timber, followed by a pause and then another. Peter stood in the sitting room, paint-streaked and tired, holding a cup of tea he had not yet lifted to his mouth. "Rats," he said. Sally's gaze lifted toward the ceiling. "It sounds careful," she whispered. Peter forced a laugh. "A careful rat?" The sound came again. Step, pause, step. Not a scurry, not the quick, nervous movement of an animal. The measured pace of something that did not fear being heard. That night, Sally lay awake listening. The house creaked as old houses do. Pipes sighed. Wind nudged the windows. Somewhere far away, an owl called once and fell silent. And above them, beneath the roof, something moved. Slowly, persistently, as though pacing. On the 5th day after the footsteps began, Peter decided to open up a wall in the upstairs corridor. "It'll make the landing wider," he said. "Better light, and there's a strange hollow sound here when you knock." Sally watched him work, holding the lantern. The wallpaper came down in dry stripes, releasing the smell like old paper and damp cloth. Beneath it, the plaster crumbled easily. Peter pried at laths and boards. The hollow sound grew louder. Then he struck something solid. Not wood, but metal. He scraped away debris and exposed the edge of a small iron ring embedded in a board. His frown deepened. They cleared the last of the plaster, and there it was. A narrow, concealed door, so well disguised beneath wallpaper and paint that it had vanished into the house's architecture like a secret swallowed. Peter hooked his finger into the ring and pulled. The door resisted, then gave with a reluctant groan. A breath of cold air slid out from the darkness beyond, carrying dust and something else, sharp and faintly sweet, like the echo of old perfume left too long in a closet drawer. Behind the door, a staircase rose steeply into the slope of the roof. It was narrow, built for someone with no fear of confined spaces. The steps were dark, worn smooth in the middle, suggesting many feet had once climbed them. Sally stared. "We didn't know it was here," she said. Peter smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Lucky find," he said. "Extra space." From above, there came a sound. Not a footstep. A soft, drawn-out exhale, as if something listened at the top of the stairs. Sally's hand tightened around the lantern. Peter raised his chin. "Hello?" he called. Silence answered, thick and heavy. Then, very faintly, a sound like fabric brushing against wood. Peter's face hardened. He took a step up. Sally caught his sleeve. "Not now," she said, her voice too low. "Not at night." Peter glanced at the gray light in the window. It was late afternoon, but in that house the shadows came early. "We'll go together," he said. "In the morning." Sally nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on that narrow staircase, and she could not shake the certainty that the darkness beyond it was not empty. Morning brought courage, as it often does, and with it the illusion that what troubled you in the dark can be explained by daylight. They climbed the hidden stairs together. The air grew colder with each step. Dust rose with every footfall and glittered in the beam of their lantern. The walls pressed close. Above them, the low roof narrowed like a throat. At the top, a hatch stood slightly ajar. Peter pushed it open. The attic beyond was larger than they expected. It ran along the length of the house, divided by old beams and low partitions. Cobwebs hung like veils. A single small window sat at the far end, its glass opaque with grime, admitting a weak gray light. There were objects up there. Not the random clutter of a neglected storage space, but things arranged with a certain care. A chair pulled close to the window, a small table, a rusted oil lamp. And on the floor, in a half circle around the chair, a scattering of old papers and dried brittle flowers. Sally stepped forward slowly. "Someone used this," she whispered. Peter moved toward the chair and touched its back. The wood was cold. He straightened. Then he saw it. A mark on the beam above the chair. A dark stain. A groove in the timber, as if a rope had once bitten deep into the wood. Peter's throat tightened. He said nothing, but Sally had followed his gaze, and she too saw the truth in the shape of that mark. In the silence that followed, the attic felt suddenly populated, not with bodies, but with memory. Sally lifted one of the papers. It crumbled at the edges, yet the writing was still legible. Ink browned with age, a woman's hand, careful controlled, as though even in private she had been taught to keep her feelings within the lines. Sally read a sentence, then another. Her face drained of color. "What is it?" Peter asked. Sally swallowed. "It's writing," she said. "About waiting, about a husband, about war." Peter's jaw tightened. Sally turned the paper over and found, pressed beneath it, a small lock of hair tied with ribbon, gray and brittle. Something moved in the darkness behind them. Not a footstep. A voice spoke, dark and terrible, layered as though more than one throat shaped it at once.
Mine.
The word did not whisper. It emerged low and resonant, as though spoken through layers of earth and timber. It seemed too large for the space, too heavy for a single mouth, and when it settled, the attic beams gave a faint, protesting groan. Sally gasped and spun around. The attic was empty. Yet the lantern flame trembled, though there was no wind, and the air carried the sudden taste of metal, like coins held too long against the tongue. Peter grabbed Sally's wrist. "We leave," he said too quickly. "Now." They descended the hidden stairs and closed the door behind them. Peter pressed it shut as if he feared it might open on its own. For the rest of that day, they spoke very little. And that night, the true horror began. It started with the knocking. 3 slow taps against the ceiling above their bedroom. Sally lay rigid beside Peter, eyes open in the dark. "Rats," Peter whispered, but his voice was thin with disbelief. The tapping came again, not above but beside, along the wall, as if something had moved down the slope of the roof. Then, a long scrape like fingernails dragged across wood. Sally clapped a hand over her mouth, to stifle a sound. Peter sat up and reached for the lantern. His hands shook as he struck a match. The light flared, and the room was almost normal. Almost. The mirror on Sally's dressing table was fogged from the inside, though the glass was cold. Letters formed slowly in the mist, as though written by an unseen fingertip. Go. Peter stared at it, his face tightening into anger. This is ridiculous, he said, as if louder words could push back the dark. He swung his legs out of bed. Sally caught him. Peter, please. He hesitated. From above, a voice descended, dark and terrible, reverberant, heavy with command. It did not sigh. It rolled through the ceiling as though the house itself gave it passage.
You have taken what was mine.
Each word struck with dreadful clarity. The air thickened as it spoke, and the lantern flame leaned toward the ceiling as if drawn by an unseen current. Sally's eyes widened. Peter went still. The voice came again, closer now, as though the plaster thinned under its weight.
You have taken what was mine.
Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow at first, deliberate, on the ceiling, crossing from one end of the room to the other. And with each step, a coldness spilled down through the plaster, chilling the air. Sally began to tremble. Peter whispered through clenched teeth, "Who are you?" The lantern flame shivered. A shape shifted in the darkness at the foot of the bed, not fully forming, not fully visible, as if smoke tried to remember how to be human. Sally felt her breath leave her. A figure stood there. It raised one hand, and the lantern went out. They slept little after that. They tried to laugh it off by day, tried to be sensible, tried to pretend that fear was a childish indulgence. But fear, once invited into a home, does not leave politely. The house interfered with them. It hid tools when Peter tried to work. It spilled nails across the floor at night so that in the morning they found sharp little teeth waiting underfoot. It turned the water in the wash basin to ice. Sally began to find damp footprints on the upstairs landing, small, careful prints as though made by a woman in slippers, always leading toward the concealed staircase, always stopping at the place where the hidden door lay behind wallpaper. At night, the voice returned. Sometimes it was only fragments, names, half-formed sentences, broken promises. Sometimes it was a low, rhythmic murmur, like prayers spoken backwards. Once, near midnight, Sally woke to the sensation of weight on the bed beside her, as if someone had sat down gently. The mattress dipped. She turned, heart pounding, and saw nothing. Yet the air smelled faintly of old perfume and damp wool. A breath brushed her cheek.
Wait.
The voice murmured, dark, intimate, wrong.
Wait until you are alone.
Sally clutched Peter and shook him awake. He rose, furious and frightened, searched the room with the lantern, found nothing. But in the morning, the attic hatch was open. Peter had sworn he had closed it. The house was changing around them, or perhaps it was merely revealing itself. Doors began to open on their own. The concealed staircase, sealed behind newly patched plaster, creaked at night as though something pressed from the other side. And always, the sense of a woman watching. Not merely haunting, but claiming. As though the house were a body, and she its will, refusing to be displaced. By the second week, Sally was hollow-eyed. Her hands shook when she lifted a cup. She flinched at any sound from above. Peter, who had once moved through the rooms with practical confidence, began to walk as though the house might bite. They argued, not loudly, never loudly, but with tight voices and long silences. "We can't leave," Peter insisted. "We've put everything into it." Sally's voice was hoarse. "Everything," she whispered, "except peace." It was Sally who went to the local office. She did it on a morning when Peter had taken the car into the nearest market town for supplies. The house was quiet then, as if it listened to his absence. Sally walked into the village beneath a sky the color of old linen. She found a small building that served as a post office, registry, and local information bureau all at once. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink and rain-damped coats. A woman behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you, love?" Sally hesitated, then said the house's address, describing its location at the edge of the village. The woman's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. A shadow passed over her eyes. "Oh," she said, and the word held more weight than it should have. "That place." Sally's throat tightened. "What do you know about it?" she asked. The woman glanced toward the door as if to ensure that no one else was listening, then leaned forward. "It's been empty for years," she said. "No one stays, not long." "Why?" The woman sighed. "It belonged to a widow," she said. "Mrs. Ellowen Harrow, though most folks just called her Miss Harrow. Her husband went off to war, never came back." Sally's hands went cold. "She waited?" she whispered. "Waited and waited," the woman said softly. "She wrote letters. She kept the lamps burning. She wouldn't accept that he was gone. And then one day, she went up into the attic." Sally could barely breathe. The woman's voice lowered. "They found her there when the smell began. Rope mark on the beam. Papers scattered like snow. After that, folks began to hear her, and then to fear her." Sally's mouth was dry. "So she haunts it?" The woman held Sally's gaze. "She doesn't want happiness under her roof," she said. "Not the kind she was denied. And whatever is up there now, It's not only a woman waiting anymore. It's something that learned how to hold on. Sally's stomach turned. Why was it sold to us? She murmured. The woman gave a humorous shrug. It always sells, she said. There's always someone with hope and not enough money. And the house, well, it's pretty. It promises things. Sally walked back to the house with the truth heavy inside her like a stone. When she reached the gate, she found it standing open. She was certain she had closed it before. The wind was still. The house waited. That night, after Peter returned, Sally told him everything. He sat very still as she spoke. His face tightened, then hardened, then began to crack. When she finished, he said quietly, "So we're being driven out." Sally's voice trembled. "Yes." Peter shook his head as though refusing the logic of it. "We can't just leave," he whispered. "We'll lose everything." Sally's eyes were wet. "Peter, we're losing ourselves." He opened his mouth to answer, but the house answered first. From above, from beneath the roof, came a long, dragging sound like a chair being pulled across boards. Then footsteps. Not careful now. Heavy. The footsteps were no longer merely heard. They were felt, each one pressing down through beam and plaster as though something vast paced above them, confined only by the limits of the roof. The voice followed, slow and merciless.
"You will not root yourselves here."
The sentence unfurled like smoke, but carried the force of iron. The walls shuddered faintly, and the temperature fell so abruptly that the air seemed to crystallize in the lungs. Sally saw her breath. Peter grabbed her hand. "Upstairs," he said. "Now!" They fled toward the stairs. Behind them, the sitting room door slammed shut. A portrait they had not noticed before, an old framed painting leaning against the wall, toppled forward and struck the floor face up. Sally glanced down as she ran, and in that single instant she saw the painted eyes of an old woman staring out from the canvas. Her mouth drawn into a line of grief so deep she seemed carved. Yet the eyes were not merely sad. They were possessive. They reached their bedroom and shut the door. Peter threw the bolt. The knocking began immediately on the other side of the door. Then a scrape. The voice no longer distant, no longer contained by the house.
"Open."
Peter backed away from the door, gripping the lantern like a weapon. Sally's lips moved in a silent prayer she did not know she remembered. The bolt rattled, though no hand touched it. The mirror fogged again. This time the letters formed more slowly, as if written with care. Wait. Then, wait for him. Sally began to sob. Peter whispered, "This is madness." The voice came through the keyhole, inhuman in its certainty.
Devotion does not end.
It said.
It only deepens.
The walls seemed to breathe. The room grew smaller, as if the house leaned in to listen. Peter's eyes darted to the window. "Out," he said. "We'll climb down." Sally grabbed his arm. "The fog," she whispered, though there was no fog outside, only dark. Yet as she spoke, something pale gathered beyond the glass. Not mist from weather, something thicker, something that moved as though it had intention. The window rattled. Sally's breath hitched. She stared, unable to look away. A face pressed faintly against the glass, not fully formed, as if the fog itself tried to remember what a face should be. Its mouth moved. No sound came through the glass, yet Sally understood the words. "Come up." Peter yanked the curtains shut. They stayed locked in the room until morning, clutching one another like children. When daylight finally seeped into the house, gray reluctant, they emerged and found the staircase door open. The concealed door, the one Peter had sealed behind new plaster. The plaster lay cracked on the floor like broken skin. The hidden stairs yawned upward. And from the darkness above came the slow, patient sound of something that was no longer waiting. It was listening. They did not last another week. It was not a single violent event that forced their decision, but the relentless stripping away of ordinary life. Sleep became rare. Appetite vanished. Silence became a threat. Every creak of the house held meaning. Every shadow seemed to watch. Sally began to see the old woman in daylight. Not fully, not always, but in reflections. In the darkened window glass, in the shine of the cattle, in the mirror when she passed too quickly. Once she turned and saw, standing at the top of the visible staircase, a figure in black, hands folded, head tilted as if listening. Sally blinked. The figure was gone, but the air remained cold. Peter, stubborn to the end, tried to fight back with reason. Boards and locks and nails. He sealed the hidden staircase again. He nailed the attic hatch shut. He set a chair beneath it. That night, the chair was found smashed on the landing. And on the attic hatch, from the inside, deep scratches scored the wood. Not scratches of an animal. The long, desperate marks of fingers that had once been human. Sally sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and said very quietly, "We're leaving." Peter looked at her for a long time. His pride fought his eyes. His exhaustion fought harder. Then he nodded, once. "Yes," he whispered. "We're leaving." They packed what they could in a single day. Their movements were frantic, not because time was short, but because the house watched them with mounting anger. By evening, as they carried the last box to the car, the footsteps began above, not pacing, running. Fast, furious steps across the attic floor. A sound tore through the house, half scream, half laugh, ragged with old grief and something worse beneath it. The front door slammed shut on its own, nearly catching Sally's fingers. Peter swore and wrenched it open. As they stepped over the threshold, the air behind them turned bitterly cold. The figure gathered itself in the entrance hall, and the darkness around it deepened until the hallway seemed to recede. It was no longer merely a widow waiting. It was a will. When it spoke, the voice no longer resembled anything human.
Devotion does not die.
The sound rolled outward, filling the hall like a storm contained within walls. Sally turned, trembling, and for the first time in all those weeks, anger flared through her feet. "We don't belong to you," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This house doesn't belong to you." For a heartbeat, silence held. Then the cold surged, as if the house drew breath. The shadow lifted its hand, and the air thickened, pressing at Sally's chest, at her throat, as though it might stop her words inside her. Peter pulled her backward. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't answer it." Sally's eyes stung with tears, but she did not look away. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Not as surrender, but as a final human refusal to become what the house demanded. The figure leaned forward slightly, and the darkness about it rippled, as though it smiled without needing a mouth.
"Then go,"
the voice said.
"And remember."
Peter did not wait for more. He dragged Sally down the path. They left the gate swinging open behind them. The village did not look up. The cottages remained calm. The fields lay indifferent beneath the fading light. Only the old house watched, as it always had. From the road, Sally glanced back once. In the attic window, a window she could have sworn was too small for any figure to stand in, she saw the faint outline of a woman in black, face turned outward, watching the car leave. Not with sorrow, with ownership. Then the shadow dissolved into darkness. The house went back on the market within the month. A fresh sign stood in the front yard. For sale. New paint, bright letters, a promise rewritten. People passed it on sunny afternoons and admired its stonework, its tall windows, its quiet elegance. Some wondered why it had not sold sooner. Others assumed with that comfortable arrogance the living always have, that they would succeed where others had failed. Hope, after all, makes liars of sensible men. On certain nights, when the air lay damp and heavy, a pale mist gathered at the edge of the garden. It crept along the path and pressed itself against the door as if listening for movement within. And above, beneath the roof, something moved with slow and deliberate patience, not waiting for return, but waiting for intrusion. Because the attic was no longer a place of grief. It was a place of claim. And what had claimed it did not forgive. The woman in the hallway. Ashvale stood at the far edge of the moors, where the land ceased to hold its shape and dissolved into mist. A few cottages leaned into the wind, their chimneys coughing smoke into the pale evening sky, and at the very end of the crooked road stood the Candlewick House. Once a grand coaching house, it now sat like a tired watcher, its roof bowed, its windows dulled with age, and its door forever creaking as though whispering secrets to the night. Several of its windows glowed faintly from within, though the light seemed unwilling to escape the glass, while others remained dark, giving the uneasy impression that parts of the house were already asleep. The front step was worn hollow by generations of passing feet, yet no recent track disturbed the damp earth before it. It gave the uneasy sense that those who reached it had been quietly guided there. It was here that Thomas Fenwick, a weary traveler and collector of old stories, arrived one autumn dusk. His coach had thrown a wheel in a deep rut several miles back, leaving him no choice but to continue on foot. His boots damp with moorland mist by the time the first houses of Ashvale emerged from the fog. He passed through narrow streets where dim lanterns burned behind windows, their light pooling weakly upon the stones and failing to reach the shadows between the buildings. Doors were shut, windows were dark. Not a single soul crossed his path, nor did any sound follow his steps, but the soft echo of his own tread and the distant sigh of wind moving through unseen chimneys. The inn's sign, a painted heron faded near white, swung on rusted chains above the door, creaking softly as it moved, as though stirred by a wind that had not yet reached the street below. Thomas paused a moment before reaching for the door. The creaking sign overhead slowed, as though reluctant to draw further attention to itself, and the fog behind him pressed closer, closing off the streets he had just walked, as if it had never existed. The door yielded beneath his hand with a muted groan, opening inward upon a wash of warmth that felt almost intrusive after the chill outside. The smell of wood smoke and damp wool drifted out to meet him, mingled with something older beneath it, the faint, stale sweetness of extinguished candles. Inside, the common room lay half in shadow. A fire burned low in the grate, its embers shifting slowly, casting uneven light across the floorboards and the dark beams overhead. A few tables stood about the room, their surfaces scarred and polished smooth by years of use, though only one was occupied. The fire crackled. A log shifted. Somewhere deeper in the house, a board creaked, not sharply, but with the slow complaint of timber adjusting to age. Then a figure moved behind the counter. Behind it stood Mr. Pritchard, the innkeeper, a stooped man with hands like old rope and eyes that seldom left the fire. "A room for the night?" Thomas asked, setting down his head. Mr. Pritchard hesitated, as though measuring the wisdom of answering. "Aye, sir. Room 9, top of the stair." He handed over a key, its metal worn smooth by long use. "But mind you, don't walk the halls after midnight. The boards remember more than they should." Thomas turned the key over in his hand. "Remember?" he asked lightly. "That seems a curious way to put it." The innkeeper did not return the smile. He glanced toward the stair, then back to the fire, lowering his voice though no one stood close enough to hear. "Strange things happen after dark. Sounds that don't belong to any living. Doors that open without cause. A light, now and again, where no lamp has been lit." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Rats, perhaps? Or the wind?" "Aye," Mr. Pritchard said after a moment. "That's what most say, at first." His fingers tightened briefly on the edge of the counter. "But the wind doesn't walk the same stretch of hallway night after night, and it doesn't carry a candle." Thomas studied him. "You're certain of that?" The innkeeper met his gaze at last. "Certain enough to warn you." For a moment neither spoke. The fire shifted in the grate, sending up a soft crackle. Then Thomas inclined his head. "Very well," he said. "I'll keep to my room." Mr. Pritchard nodded once. "That would be wise." That evening, Thomas returned to the hearth. The fire burned steadily now, its warmth drawing the shadows closer, and Mr. Pritchard poured him a small glass of brandy without being asked. It was there, by the fireplace, that Thomas made the acquaintance of the inn's only other guest. The man sat opposite the flames, his features half lit, half lost to shadow. There was nothing remarkable in his manner, save for the way his eyes never quite rested, as though he were listening for something beyond the crackle of the fire. "The innkeeper warned me not to walk the halls after midnight," Thomas said quietly. "He spoke of strange things." "He would not warn you without reason." "So you believe there is truth in it?" "I know there is," the man replied. He glanced toward the darkened stair. "She walks. When the moon is bright, a woman with a candle. She was to be married once, waited here for a man who never returned from the sea." He paused. "Some say she still waits." Thomas turned slightly in his chair. Through the tall window beside the hearth, a pale beam of moonlight had found its way into the room, resting across the floorboards like a spill of cold milk. He followed it upward to where the full moon hung low and wide above the moors. "And tonight," he said, returning his gaze to the fire, "with the moon so bright, do you think she still walks?" He received no answer. Thomas frowned and looked across the hearth. The chair opposite him stood empty, the firelight revealing no sign that anyone had sat there at all. For a moment, Thomas remained where he was, listening to the soft crackle of the flames and the distant settling of the house, wondering how long the man had been absent. and whether he had even truly been there to begin with. When the inn had gone still, Thomas climbed the narrow stairs to his room. The corridor stretched long and crooked, lined with portraits so darkened by smoke that the faces seemed half erased. His candle wavered as he unlocked his door. Inside, the chamber was spare but clean. A bed, a small writing desk, a mirror dulled with age. The wind moaned faintly down the chimney. Thomas undressed, washed his face, set his watch on the bedside table, and let the candle burn a little longer than was sensible before the weariness of the long day claimed him and he fell asleep. Sometime past midnight, he woke without knowing why. For a moment he lay still, suspended between sleep and waking, aware only of a faint unease that clung to him like a half-remembered dream. The room felt different, colder somehow, and the silence seemed too deliberate, as though something were listening. A soft sound reached him then, distant at first, scarcely more than a suggestion. A subtle shift. The faint complaint of wood settling. He wondered if he had imagined it, if the long day and the heavy air of the inn had carried him into uneasy dreams. Then he became aware of another sensation, the unmistakable feeling of being no longer alone. The candle had gone out. Moonlight spilled through the narrow window, pale and cold. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps. Slow, careful, bare feet on wood. He sat up, hard hammering. Beneath his door, a faint strip of light moved, as if a candle passed by. "Hello?" he called, but the sound barely left his throat. The steps paused. Then, very softly, the door handle turned. He leaped from the bed and threw the door open. The corridor was empty. Only the portrait stared back at him. Then, far down the hall, a woman stood. Her gown was white, her hair dark and loose, and in her hand she carried a candle whose flame burned without smoke. Her eyes reflected the candlelight strangely, dark and hollow, as though something essential behind them had long since gone missing. "Madam?" he said, his voice trembling despite himself. With a sudden flare of her candle, the woman vanished, leaving the passage empty and cold, as though she had never stood there at all. The hallway felt dark, and the smell of salt and old roses filled the air. The next morning, Thomas found Mr. Pritchard by the fire, staring into the embers. "I saw her," Thomas said. The innkeeper closed his eyes. "Aye, most do the first night." "Who was she truly?" Mr. Pritchard poked at the fire. "Eleanor Ray. Came here near 20 years ago. Said she was to be married. Stayed in room 11, the one beside yours. Wrote letters each day, waiting on her sailor. One night she went walking the hall with her candle. The next morning she was gone. Only her locket left on the floor. Found her?" Mr. Pritchard did not answer at once. He stared into the fire as though expecting something to surface there. At last, he shook his head. No one ever does. Thomas leaned forward. Yet the room remains. The innkeeper's mouth tightened. Aye, he said quietly, though I've long since stopped thinking of it as being kept at all. He poked at the embers, sending a faint spray of sparks upward. Some places don't need tending. They remember well enough on their own. By noon, curiosity had overcome fear. Thomas asked to see the room. The innkeeper refused to accompany him, pressing the key into Thomas's hand instead, his expression making it clear he wouldn't go any farther. The key turned stiffly in the lock, the door reluctant to open. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed for years. The curtains were drawn, and on the dresser sat a cracked mirror, its glass clouded. Beneath it lay a small, leather-bound diary, brittle with age. He opened it with care. March 7th. The wind keeps me awake. The sea sounds like a voice. March 10th. He will come when the moon is full. He promised he would find me by the hallway light. March 13th. Someone walks outside my door. When I open it, there's only the candle burning. March 15th. The waves are calling. I must go to him. Tomorrow night, when the moon is high. The final page was blank, save for a smear of candle wax. Thomas felt the chill of the room settle into his bones. There was, suddenly, the unmistakable sense of an unseen presence pressing close upon him, urging him away as though his continued stay there was neither desired nor permitted. That night, he resolved to keep watch. The moon rose early, white as bone, flooding the narrow passage with paler light. He sat in his chair, candle beside him, notebook open, waiting. At the stroke of midnight, the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath fogged the air. Then, from down the hall, the sound of a door creaking open. Eleanor stepped into view. She moved as though in water, her candlelight quivering on the walls. Her face was not hideous, not even sad, but distant, fixed on something beyond him. She drifted past his door without a sound, her skirts brushing the floor. Thomas followed, candle trembling in his hand. She led him to the far end of the hall where a large portrait hung. A young woman and a sailor, hand in hand. The canvas trembled gently as she approached it, and then, impossibly, she walked through it. Thomas gasped. The painting swung forward on its nail, revealing a narrow hidden passage behind him. He entered. A draft of cold, briny air met him. At the end of the short corridor stood a window overlooking the moor and the faint glimmer of the sea beyond. Beneath it, half buried in dust, lay a silver locket. Inside were two miniature portraits. The same woman, the same sailor. He understood then. Eleanor had come here each night believing her lover's spirit would return with the tide. On her final night, she must have stepped through this very window into the fog, chasing the ghost of the man she loved. At dawn, Mr. Pritchard found Thomas asleep in the hallway chair, the candle burned to nothing beside him. He said nothing, only nodded when Thomas handed him the locket. "She's gone," Thomas said quietly. "Aye," said the innkeeper, gazing down the now silent corridor. "The house feels lighter." From outside, the first light of morning touched the old windows, and somewhere far away a seabird cried. And though the Candlewick house still stood on the moors, lonely as ever, the guests who came after spoke of quiet nights. No footsteps, no whispers, no flicker of a stray candle. Only on certain moonlit evenings, when the wind was still and the rooms asleep, a faint scent of salt and roses drifted down the hallway, as though someone had just passed by, on her way home at last. The Midnight Carnival. The antique shop stood at the quiet end of the town's main street, half hidden between a shuttered bakery and an old tailor's shop that looked as though it had not opened its doors in years. Its windows were filled with the sort of objects that seemed to belong to another time: dusty clocks, cracked porcelain dolls, tarnished brass lanterns, and faded books whose titles had long since been forgotten. The young traveler had not intended to stop there. He had arrived in the town only that afternoon, passing through on foot as he often did during his long wanderings across the countryside. A warm autumn evening had settled over the quiet streets, and the small glow of light in the antique shop window had drawn his curiosity like a moth toward a lantern. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, paper, and something faintly sweet, perhaps dried herbs or the lingering scent of tobacco smoked years ago. The shop was deeper than it appeared from the outside. Narrow aisles ran between shelves stacked high with forgotten things. Every surface held some curious relic from the past. Behind a tall wooden counter stood an elderly shopkeeper with thin silver hair and round spectacles perched low on his nose. He looked up as the traveler entered, though he said nothing at first. The traveler wandered slowly through the aisles, running his fingers along the spines of old books and examining strange trinkets whose purposes had long since been lost. One book in particular caught his attention. It was bound in worn leather and decorated with faded illustrations of traveling carnivals, bright tents, smiling performers, and towering rides that seemed to scrape the clouds. Curious, he opened it. The pages crackled softly as they turned. The ink drawing showed scenes from old fairs and carnivals that had once wandered from town to town across the countryside many decades ago. As he flipped to the middle of the book, something slipped loose and fluttered gently to the floor. It was a small piece of paper. The traveler bent down and picked it up. It was an old ticket. The paper had yellowed with age, and the ink had faded almost to gray, but the words were still clearly visible. Midnight Carnival. The traveler smiled faintly. He turned the ticket over in his hand, studying the simple design. Then he noticed the shopkeeper standing beside him. The old man had moved silently across the room. His pale eyes rested on the ticket in the traveler's hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You found that inside the book?" the shopkeeper asked quietly. "Yes," the traveler replied. "Strange place for a carnival ticket." The old man studied the ticket for a long moment. "That carnival has not been seen here for many years," he said at last. The traveler laughed softly. "I suppose the ticket is only part of the book's decoration." The shopkeeper did not smile. "If I were you," he said slowly, "I would leave that ticket where you found it." The traveler raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The shopkeeper hesitated. Then he shook his head. "Just an old story," he said. The traveler slipped the ticket into his coat pocket and purchased the book. Outside, the evening had grown darker. The moon had risen above the rooftops, casting a pale glow over the quiet town. The traveler followed the road out toward the countryside, the antique shop slowly disappearing behind him. The road stretched between wide empty fields and dark lines of distant trees. The air had grown colder as the night deepened, and a thin mist had begun creeping across the ground. The traveler walked for some time beneath the bright full moon. The countryside was silent, except for the soft rustle of wind moving through tall grass. Then he heard something unexpected. At first he thought it was only the wind, but the sound came again. Faint, distant. Music. Not ordinary music. A strange, cheerful melody played by what sounded like an old carnival organ. The traveler stopped walking. He listened carefully. Yes, there it was again, soft notes drifting through the mist. Curious, he stepped off the road and walked across the open field toward the sound. The fog grew thicker as he crossed the grass. Then he saw the lights. At first, they appeared as small golden points shining through the mist, but as he drew closer, the shapes slowly became clearer. Lanterns, dozens of them, hanging from tall wooden posts and swaying gently in the night breeze. Beyond them stood a carnival. The traveler stopped in surprise. Only an hour earlier, he had passed this very field. It had been empty. Yet now brightly colored tents rose from the fog. Strings of lanterns illuminated pathways winding between game booths and food stalls. And above everything, turning slowly against the moonlit sky, stood a towering ride. The Great Wheel. Its empty seats moved lazily through the air as the wheel rotated, creaking softly with each turn. The traveler stared in amazement. Music drifted through the fog. Warm golden light spilled across the grass. The smell of sweets filled the night air. Caramel apples, cotton candy, roasted nuts. The carnival seemed strangely alive, yet oddly quiet at the same time. As the traveler approached the entrance, a tall figure stepped forward from the shadows. The man wore an old-fashioned black coat and a tall hat. His face was pale and thin, his expression unreadable. "Good evening," the figure said politely. His voice was soft but carried easily through the quiet air. "Welcome to the Midnight Carnival." The traveler smiled. "I didn't realize there was a carnival in this part of the country." "There is tonight," the man replied. He gestured toward the lantern-lit pathways. "Please, enjoy yourself." The traveler stepped inside. The carnival was filled with games and rides, though strangely few people seemed to be speaking. Pale visitors wandered slowly between the stalls, their movements calm and quiet. The traveler approached the first game booth. A row of glass bottles stood on a wooden shelf. "Try your luck, sir," said the attendant. The traveler tossed the ball. Every bottle fell. The attendant handed him a prize. The traveler laughed. At the next booth, he tried another game, and again, he won. Every game, every time. The rides were just as strange. When he stepped onto the great wheel, the seat lifted him higher and higher into the night sky. The ride seemed to last far longer than it should. Below him, the carnival lights glowed through the fog like scattered stars. The music continued playing. But as the traveler descended back toward the ground, he began to notice something strange. The other visitors, they were not smiling. They moved slowly. Their faces were pale, and their eyes seemed distant, almost empty. The traveler stepped away from the ride, feeling a sudden chill. A cold wind swept across the carnival grounds. The lantern lights flickered. The music wavered. Then something skittered across the dirt path and landed at his feet. A torn page of newspaper. The traveler bent down and picked it up. The headline was large and dark across the top of the page. "Several dead in carnival accident." The article described a terrible disaster. A ride had collapsed during a traveling carnival many years ago. The accident had happened shortly after midnight, in this very field. The traveler felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He looked slowly around the carnival. The pale visitors had stopped moving. All of them were staring at him. Then the clock tower near the entrance began to ring. Once, twice, 3 times. The midnight hour. With every chime, the lantern lights dimmed. The music slowed. The fog thickened. The visitors began fading slowly into the mist, until only the tall promoter remained standing near the entrance. The traveler turned toward the road, but the road was gone. The fog surrounded the field in every direction. Behind him, the great wheel creaked, turning slowly. The wheel slowed. One empty seat descended toward the ground. It stopped directly before him. The music faded into silence, and from somewhere in the fog, a quiet voice whispered,
"Your ride is ready."
The traveler stepped backward, but the fog closed in. The lanterns flickered once more, and the great wheel began to turn again, slowly carrying its silent riders through the cold midnight air. And sometimes, on quiet country roads when the moon is full, travelers still claim they hear faint carnival music drifting through the fog. And far away in an empty field, a great wheel turning slowly in the night.